Good afternoon and welcome to Moral Grandstanding in American Discourse. Is it a problem? Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Matt Jordan, and I have the privilege of serving as the Dean of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Humanities Center at Cuyahoga Community College, the sponsor of today's event. To provide some context, the Mandel Humanities Center has a mission focused on both our institution and our community. Here at Tri-C, our principal focus is the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Scholars Academy, an academic program focused on humanities education, leadership development, and civic engagement. Students in the program receive a scholarship designed to cover the full cost of tuition, fees, and books for Cuyahoga County residents, and have access to numerous transfer opportunities as well as fully funded educational activities, including concerts, lectures, film screenings, and out-of-state trips. I would be remiss if I failed to note that we are now accepting applications for the fall 2022 semester. Beyond Tri-C's 4 campuses, the Mandel Humanities Center seeks to serve the people of Northeast Ohio more broadly. Cuyahoga Community College is the community's college, and the Mandel Humanities Center is a venue for educational events and thoughtful discussion of contentious and important topics. Today's program is part of the 2022 Cleveland Humanities Festival, sponsored by Case Western Reserve University. The festival's theme this year is discourse, a topic of enormous importance in an age of social media, political polarization, and ever-increasing tribalism. How can we better engage with our fellow citizens as we seek to make progress on issues where people disagree deeply and care passionately? What are some of the perils and pitfalls of public discourse in America today? Questions like these are the impetus for today's event, and we have invited a pair of philosophers to help us think about the answers. Our first guest is Dr. Brandon Warmke, an associate professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University. He's written widely on topics such as forgiveness, moral responsibility, public discourse, and politics. With co-author Justin Tosi, he published his first book, Grandstanding, The Use and Abuse of Moral Talk, in 2020. And is now working on a second book titled Why It's Okay to Mind Your Own Business, also in partnership with Justin Tosi. He has written for CNN and MarketWatch, and his work has been featured by The Atlantic, New York Times Magazine, HuffPost, Scientific American, Forbes, Vox, Commentary Magazine, and The Guardian. Also joining us today is Justin Weinberg, an associate professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. He teaches, writes, and speaks about various issues in moral and political philosophy, disagreement, and the nature and value of philosophy itself. He is also the creator and editor of Daily News, a news and discussion website for philosophers. Our plan for the conversation is as follows. Dr. Warmke will kick us off with roughly 8 minutes on what moral grandstanding is and why it worries him. And Dr. Weinberg will have 6 minutes in which to explain his reasons for dissenting. Then I'll ask each of our guests to respond briefly to what the other has said. I will then ask a few questions of my own, and during the last portion of the conversation, we'll ask Dr. Warmke and Dr. Weinberg to respond to questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask one or both of them a question during the live event, please send it via email to mandelcenter@tri-c.edu. Dr. Warmke, the webcam is yours.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jordan, for that kind introduction, and I appreciate the invitation. I'm happy to be here with the Cleveland Humanities Festival, and I also appreciate Professor Weinberg for joining us for this conversation. So the question is moral grandstanding a problem? Is it a problem in American discourse? And I suspect that most people who are tuning in have a general idea about what moral grandstanding is, as Dr. Jordan mentioned. Okay, I'm having trouble sharing my PowerPoint. It's not, okay, there it is. As Dr. Jordan mentioned, Justin Tosi and I wrote this book a few years ago, and where we give an account of what moral grandstanding is, what does it mean to grandstand. And for our purposes here, grandstanding is just when people use moral talk for self-promotion, where moral talk is talk of justice or rights or what people are owed or right or wrong. And people grandstand when they use these discussions of morality and politics, not primarily to help other people or to get at the truth or for standing up for what's right, but they're using these conversations for selfish, egoistic reasons. They're engaging in conversations on Twitter or on cable news or in a politician's podium simply because they want to self-promote, or mostly because they want to self-promote. They want people to think of them as morally great, very morally sensitive. And why do people do this? Because of something we all want. We all want status. We all want people to think well of us, especially people in our in-groups. We want to be thought of as morally impressive or morally insightful. And so it's very tempting to grandstand. Psychologists talk about two different kinds of status. One kind of status is status that we get by having prestige, people thinking well of us, looking up to us. We lift ourselves up to get status that way. We also can get status by dominating other people. And if you spent any time on Twitter, you've probably seen this kind of phenomenon where people will treat other people in the outgroup horribly, call them names, say how bad they are. And we often do this, we grandstand because we want to push other people down. So one way to get status is by sort of puffing ourselves up, and we can also grandstand and get status by pushing other people down. Now, what does grandstanding look like? Well, if you spent any time on social media, a lot of this will not be new to you. But one form of grandstanding is what we call piling on. And this is when you just add your voice to the conversation, largely because you want to be seen on the right side. You want to be seen as taking a stand. Some piling on occurs because we want to praise people we like. We want to be seen as praising the people. This is the most honorable and courageous and brave thing I've ever seen. Some piling on is more negative. We join in on the Twitter sort of shaming and sanctioning and trying to get people fired, not because we think maybe they deserve it, but because we're adding our voice to the cacophony of loud, angry voices to show that this is not going to stand. I am the moral guardian. This person's going to get what they deserve. Another form that grandstanding can take. Sorry, the PowerPoint here is not working. I don't know what's going on. Is what do I call this? Ramping up. So ramping up happens when people take a stand in order to outdo others. So this is a Twitter conversation I like to point out. So it went from punch Nazis to F it, just punch white men pretty quick, huh? And someone replies, if you're a white man with the Richard Spencer haircut, I'm just going to assume you're a Nazi and hit you, to be honest. And then someone chimes in to outdo the other two guys here. Honestly, just being a white man alone is reason enough for me to hit him at this point. So ramping up happens when we make increasingly strong claims or more powerful claims about what we're talking about. And the idea is that we're just trying to outdo others. Someone says this person's behavior was unjust, and I say, how dare you? If you really cared about justice, you'd want this person thrown in jail. And the result is that we turn moral discourse into an arms race. People are competing for social status. That status is, there's very little of it to go around. Not all of us can be high status. And so people compete for the moral goodies. They want to be seen as morally impressive. Another way that people grandstand is by engaging in excessive emotional displays or reports. Often this takes the form of outrage. And you can use outrage. Psychologists tell us that you can outrage pretty reliably to communicate to people that you're morally sensitive. So if your goal was to get people to think that you care deeply about some issue, one way to do that strategically is to express lots of outrage. So these are the three ways among many people grandstand. I have to point out that just because you're outraged or just because you sign a petition or pile on, that doesn't necessarily mean you're grandstanding. It's just that those are ways that people grandstand. So the question is grandstanding a problem? And I want to say yes. I want to say grandstanding has, we'll talk about three very briefly, significant social costs that we all have to bear because people choose to use moral discourse as an self-image project. And the first one is political polarization. And many of you will be familiar with this phenomenon, whereby people in America largely are being pushed to extremes along both ideological and affective grounds. So people just hate each other more, they dislike the other side more. And it turns out, we've done some research with some psychologists, 6 studies with about 7,000 participants, and it looks like grandstanding is actually pushing people to extremes. People who grandstand more tend to have more extreme views, and over longitudinal studies, it looks like this relationship is causal. In other words, grandstanding is actually pushing people to the edges. And this is largely because of the ramping up effect. In order to stand out and get attention on Twitter, for example, you have to outdo other people. And what's interesting to note is that what's pushing us apart is not evidence or good arguments. It's not like we're being convinced by more extreme views because of the evidence. We're being pushed to opposite sides because of our desire to look impressive. We simply want to stake out the ground of the most pure, of the most extreme. And that's bad. It's bad to have an electorate that is polarized deeply because it inhibits compromise, and it also makes us hate each other more. Furthermore, another social cost of grandstanding is interpersonal conflict. So some other studies that we've done suggest that grandstanding tends to create conflict in your personal life. If you or someone you know is on social media constantly trying to use morality and politics to puff up their social image, chances are they have lots of conflict in their personal life, and this is not surprising. I mean, turning the public square into a moral arms race is not unlikely to breed competition for status, disrespect, a punitive attitude towards others, and lots of anger. So that's a second kind of social cost of grandstanding. A third one is what we call outrage exhaustion. So one of those forms of grandstanding that I mentioned is lots of outrage. It's hard to spend time on Twitter or Facebook or watching cable news and not see people angry all the time. The problem is when we use outrage to show off, it becomes a less reliable signal of injustice. So outrage is important. It's a way for us to identify really bad things in the world. And when you see outrage, that's a signal that like we should do something about it. But if we express outrage at the same level for genocide as it is, some young adult author didn't diversify, chapter 4 enough, if we're using the same level of outrage for everything, outrage becomes a less reliable signal in 2 different ways. It's harder to muster outrage when we actually need it. So it's just going to be harder to get mad if you're mad all the time when something comes along that really merits outrage. This is a kind of a boy who cried wolf effect. But it's also harder to identify what really merits outrage. So if you scroll up Twitter, and you look and see what really is serious, sometimes it can be difficult to know if everyone is outraged about everything, what should our priorities be? So those are 3 problems that Justin Tosi and I talk about grandstanding having in the book. And I want to just close here with a question. And what is the point of public discourse? If I had to ask you to give a list of things that are, why should we engage in public discourse? You might say things like, well, we should solve social problems. You might say, well, we should, we use these conversations to address injustice in the world. You might say something like, well, we have these important conversations about policy or morality to promote welfare. And you might give me a very long list of things that we are supposed to use public discourse for. I suspect that on that list, you would not say that we are to use public discourse to provide a forum to allow us to impress people with how good we think we are. I don't think most people would list that as a reason why we should engage in public discourse, but this is exactly what grandstanding does, what grandstanders do. And I suspect that the reason why you wouldn't put this on this list is because we all instinctively know, Professor Weinberg, I think, is going to disagree. I think we all instinctively know that this is not what public discourse is for. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Wormke. Let's now turn to Justin Weinberg for a contrary perspective. Dr. Weinberg, take it away.
Thanks. Thanks again for having me, and thanks to Brandon for his comments. So I'll agree with Brandon that moral grandstanding sometimes happens. just like some people lie, sometimes people exaggerate. They say obnoxious things to each other. They pretend to know things they don't. They sometimes hastily dismiss people with different views and so on. All of these things are bad aspects of public discourse, and moral grandstanding sometimes happens. The question is, how big a problem is it? Is it really the kind of big problem that we need to address, to worry about, to try to get rid of? So to figure that out, well, let's take a closer look at what moral grandstanding is. So one of the things that Brandon and his co-author Justin Tosi identify as part of moral grandstanding is that when someone utters a moral claim to make themselves look good, they have to have that part, that last part, to make themselves look good in there, this recognition desire, this goal to have some kind of moral boost in the eyes of others, or moral to look better in the eyes of others. It could be an explicit desire you have, it could be a kind of subconscious desire you have, but that's got to be there. So if we're going to say that there's a lot of moral grandstanding going on, it seems like we have to be really good at mind reading. We have to figure out, not only are these people saying these words, but they're saying them for this reason, to make themselves look better. And I think we don't have a lot of good evidence for that claim. And I think, therefore, that maybe there isn't as much moral grandstanding going on as Brandon seems to think there is. Now, you might be saying, okay, come on already. Look at Twitter, look at Facebook. We see obvious forms of moral grandstanding going on. And I hear you, but I also think that we should be cautious in making that assumption that what's going on is moral talk to self-promote, because it's very easy and very tempting to make those kinds of accusations. There are 5 reasons to be worried about one's temptation to say what they're up to is self-promoting moral talk. The first is that it's easy, and we're tempted to do easy rather than more difficult things. There's nothing easier than dismissing what someone else has to say rather than listening to it, trying to figure out what it is that they're saying and whether it's true. I don't need to know what evidence or argument there might be for something if I just can assume that the person is a kind of faker. And so if I'm tempted to do the easier rather than harder thing, then I'm going to be tempted to accuse someone of moral grandstanding. That's the first thing. It's easier. Second of all, it's more comfortable. A lot of times people who are making moral complaints on social media or in public discourse are telling us things that we might disagree with, things that might go against our way of life, things that we believe. And as a result, it might make us uncomfortable. Some people are making really extreme claims that would suggest that our ordinary ways of life, or what we think of as ordinary ways of life, are themselves really morally problematic. And so that can make us uncomfortable, and we might be deterred from believing that what they're up to is sincere if instead we could, again, be dismissive of them, maintain our own moral comfort with ourselves, and put aside and not take seriously what they're saying. That is, just assume that they're a kind of self-serving faker. Third reason to be cautious about these accusations is that it's intellectually self-serving. When we think about the kinds of moral statements we're most likely to identify as instances of grandstanding, there'll be statements about which we think of the person saying them, they couldn't possibly be serious, right? Such statements might make factual claims we think are obviously false, or evaluative claims about what's good and bad, or right or wrong, that we think are implausible. And we might think, given their implausibility, the only reason people could be making these claims is because they want to boost their moral status in the eyes of others. But the thing is people have had various different kinds of experiences, various different ways of seeing the world, and they could very well mean what they're saying. And accusations of grandstanding risk mistaking difference for insincerity. And I think we should be on guard about that. We should take seriously the idea that we might not know all there is to know, might not have experienced all the relevant things that are important for whatever it is we're talking about. So the fourth thing to be on guard against regarding these accusations is that we should, if we're interested in self-serving moral status, right, and sort of promoting our moral status, which seems to be sort of the basic idea that Brandon wants to say that we're all tempted to engage in to promote our status one way or another. we should recognize that we'll be tempted to make accusations of moral grandstanding on that same basis. Because after all, to call someone out as a faker, to be your kind of possibly risk-taking truth teller about the BS that's happening, is to yourself take this moral stand about what's going on. You are, in a way, elevating yourself as a truth teller, as someone who recognizes what's really going on, and pushing down someone else who is, on your account, just engaged in moral grandstanding. So if we have reason to be suspicious about moral utterances when they're possibly self-serving in this grandstanding way, then we should likewise be worried about our own temptation to dismiss claims as instances of moral grandstanding. So the last thing I'll add before I run out of time here is a fifth reason to be worried about accusations of moral grandstanding. And this fifth reason is owed to an idea from social psychology called the availability heuristic. So sometimes we form judgments about a kind of phenomenon based not on facts about the phenomenon or the statistics about that phenomenon, but rather what most readily comes to mind, like the news stories about it. So people will fear plane crashes more than is warranted, and because they don't happen that much, but that's what we hear about when we hear about plane travel. We don't hear about all the uneventful flights, right? Likewise, when it comes to moral talk, the moral talk we might hear most about is moral talk that's hypocritical, that is indeed instances of grandstanding. And so when we see other forms of moral talk, especially moral talk that makes us uncomfortable, we might say, oh, it's just got to be like this stuff we hear about all the time, right? But we have to be on guard against mistaking mistaking our ability to recall a certain kind of moral talk, the most memorable forms of hypocrisy, for example, as a descriptor for ordinary moral talk. Ordinary moral talk might just be completely sincere a lot of the time. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Professor Weinberg. I appreciate that. I think I agree with almost everything you said. And the reason I'm able to do that is because your arguments, several of which we give in the book, are arguments against accusing people of grandstanding or calling out people for grandstanding. And I agree that in general, it's bad to accuse people or to call out people for grandstanding. In large part for several of the reasons that you mentioned. I mean, it's very difficult to know whether someone is grandstanding because you don't have access to their minds. It's also, psychologists tell us it's very difficult to know whether someone is lying. We're actually not better than the flip of a coin in determining whether someone is lying. And so it's general to go around whenever you think maybe someone's saying something false to be like, oh, you liar, you lied to me. It would be bad to go around accusing people of lying in that way. And similarly, we think it's bad to accuse people of grandstanding. And so it's no part of our argument, it's no part of our concerns about grandstanding that requires going around accusing people of grandstanding for the similar reason that you might be worried about the morality of lying. You might think lying is really bad. And yet it would also be bad to go around accusing people of lying whenever you suspected them of saying something false. And so I'm happy to, I agree with you. I think those are all excellent reasons to not accuse people of grandstanding. But that doesn't make that doesn't mean that grandstanding is not a problem. And so if you think grandstanding is common, and I think some of our research suggests that it is, you can actually get people to basically admit that they do use these discussions to promote their image and look good. I think it would be shocking if people were selfish in the marketplace and all on the dating market, but somehow they became moral paragons, when they fired up Twitter. That would be a little surprising if there was this magical zone where people weren't trying to seek status all the time. And so, I agree with you that grandstanding is not something we can go around accusing people of. It's why we don't do it in the book. We don't do it on social media. But that doesn't mean it's not a problem. And so I think for all the reasons I've given, I think there's still lots to worry about. Now, you might wonder, well, what are we supposed to do then about grandstanding if we're not supposed to call people out? And what we advise is just to self-reflect. So to ask the question, am I doing good or am I just trying to look good? and try to sort of bring humility into our public discourse that way, instead of going around, as you rightly note, monitoring others' mental states and trying to figure out if they're grandstanding. I think that'd be very bad.
Okay, so I appreciate that, and I think that it's good that you're not in the business of pointing out, or telling us to point out where people are grandstanding. However, there does seem to be a kind of tension between, on the one hand, saying, because of these various epistemic problems and possible biases and self-serving interests and so on, we have to be on guard against making accusations of grandstanding, to, on the other hand, diagnosing society as rife with moral grandstanding. I mean, to say that there's a lot of it going on is to say that there are people who are engaging in grandstanding. It's to have some confidence in some kind of general, broad characterization of society. So I think that drawing attention to it as a widespread social problem implies being able to diagnose it in individuals. If we weren't able to do it, if we weren't able to diagnose it in individuals, we'd have no basis for saying, as you do many times throughout the book, for example, that this is a common problem, it happens a lot, it's all over the place, and so on. I think that you're right. It would be remarkable if people were selfish in some contexts and not selfish in these particular contexts, like social discourse contexts. But the thing is, people aren't all selfish everywhere else. And there are various ways one might pursue self-interested motives. Like if I want to look moral, a good way to do that would be to be moral, right? So we might think that making moral utterances, that might make me look good, but making them and not living in a way that's contrary to them or in a way that's living up to them, right, could be good. In fact, people might make moral utterances in order to be held accountable to them or to live up to them. Or they might be on balance beneficial by providing ideas for others themselves to live up to. So I do think that, I guess I'll just leave it at that, and we can go back and forth a bit if you want. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. I really appreciate not only the content of this, but also the tone. One of the reasons that we like to host conversations like this when we can is that we live in a culture that's not great at disagreement. There's certainly plenty of disagreement out there, but it's refreshing to see people engage on a topic where they hold different views, but can do so in a way that's thoughtful and hopefully thought-provoking rather than antagonistic. So let me ask, as we move into more of a conversational part of this, Brandon, could you start us off, just for the sake of folks who maybe haven't really thought about these topics before, maybe they're encountering the language of moral grandstanding for the first time. Just remind us once more, what is moral grandstanding? Can you give us the definition? And, is it, because you clearly don't think it's the same thing as, say, hypocrisy. So can you flesh out the concept for us one more time?
Sure. So very simply put, the bumper sticker description is the use of moral talk for self-promotion. So this can be a little complicated because you're right, it doesn't mean you're a hypocrite. It doesn't mean that you're saying anything false. You could say something true and still grandstand. It's just selfish or egoistic uses of moral discourse. So as Justin nicely pointed out, grandstanding is you're motivated by this desire to seek status. It sort of predominates. It may not be the only motivation for why you're saying what you're saying, but it's a very strong motivator for what you're doing. You get carried away. The feeling of like righteous indignation you feel on Twitter. You're like, oh, I gotta say this. I gotta get this out. It's sort of that sort of motivation. And then you're making a claim about morality and politics. So you can compare it a little bit to lying, although the comparison is disanalogous in lots of respects, but it's analogous in this respect. It requires saying something and with a kind of specific sort of motivation. So you're saying these things about morality and politics largely because you want to impress people with your moral bona fides.
Well, thank you. So a number of follow-up questions here, and I can see we're already starting to get some from the audience as well. So I'll do my best to keep things in a more or less logical order. But one thing I want to ask you both about as we get going here is, I get the impression from social media, and I think looking around at some of the things that have been written about your book, Brandon, and some of the discussion that's online, I don't think I'm the only one who gets the sense that moral grandstanding is something that folks on the political and cultural right seem to be worried about, and that folks on the political cultural left do not seem to be as worried about. I'm curious to know if you would both agree with that characterization, and if that's right, what are the reasons for it?
Go ahead, Justin.
Okay, so I mean, I think that the definition of moral grandstanding is neutral in itself across the political spectrum, as Brandon and his co-author Justin Tosi describe it. That said, though, I do share the view that you have, that the accusations seem to come more from the right, directed at the left. There's this idea, perhaps, that it's hard to, how could these people really care so much about this stuff that's happening, right? And I do think that it's of a piece, the accusation of moral grandstanding, at least sometimes, can be of a piece with other kinds of dismissive characterizations of ideas on the left, like, oh, that's just political correctness or something like that. Another thing we just don't have to take substantively seriously because we could dismiss it as political incorrectness. I do think, though, that listening to people and taking complaints seriously and not dismissing them as instances of grandstanding is important, and it's a part of moral progress. One example of this would be the recognition of sexual harassment in the last third of the 20th century as an actual problem. Right? That went from describing certain kinds of behavior as par for the course, just something to be expected. Oh, it's attention that's flattering or something like that, to people complaining about it. And you can imagine if it were in today's social media, right? People are there. What are they complaining about? What are they? It's just, how could they really be so upset? It's just a grope here or there or whatever. It's a compliment or something like that, right? Why are they so upset? Well, taking that seriously, right, has led us to a different set of beliefs regarding appropriate workplace behavior. So I think, taking things seriously can lead to moral progress, and dismissiveness is not what we should be aiming for.
So I agree. I think I agree with both of you. The perception and perhaps the reality is that the accusations do tend to seem like they're coming more from the right. I mean, I just have two thoughts. One is that I think this is, in a way, an artifact of the moment. So if you think back to Obama, there's lots of headlines you can find of Obama calling Republicans grandstanders. And if you go back to the 80s, I think many of us are old enough to remember there was a social and political movement called the moral majority on the right. The moral majority, right? And so I think they were often seen as sort of grandstanders and sort of like these sort of moral peddlers. The other thing I'll point out is that I do think that what you think about the partisan divide of accusations depends on what word you use. So suppose you use the term performative allyship. A lot of people on the left are concerned about what they call performative allyship, being an ally, performing to sort of be a part of, and supporting these groups. And so if you ask people, where does that accusation tend to come from? I think it does tend to come from the left. But you might think performative allyship is just a sort of a different kind of term for talking about this sort of ostentatious self-seeking status that people can get from using morality.
That's interesting. And I'd like to stay in sort of the political realm for a minute. It's fairly easy to do with this topic. But Brandon, you suggested in your presentation that grandstanding is both more likely among people who are at the extreme ends of the political cultural spectrum, and you said this was, I thought, a very provocative claim that that it actually makes people more extreme, so it pushes them further to the edges. Can you recap the gist of that argument, and then just I'm interested to hear your response to that particular assertion, whether you are inclined to agree or if you have questions or concerns about that line of thinking.
Yeah, so a couple of things that we have discovered or suggested by some of the scientific work we've done is that if you think about the partisan divide when it comes to grandstanding, there isn't one. So it forms a kind of U curve. The right seems to be just as inclined to grandstand as the left, but as you point out, it looks like the more you are at the extreme, the more likely you are to grandstand. And then some of our data suggests that grandstanding is actually causing people to take more extreme views. Now, why might that be? Well, one reason why that might be is that in order to stand out and get status, you have to sort of say something new. You're probably not, given our culture, going to become known as a rock star activist or a paragon of the Republican Party by saying super boring milquetoast things. That's not a way to get status. The way to get status is to say something people haven't heard before or haven't thought before, and sort of back it up with some moral language that is appealing to people. And so that's what happens. And then you have these sort of trendsetters, whether they be politicians or activists, sort of pushing the limits on, our public policy. And then you have people who are fans of these people. So if I follow this person on Twitter, I generally believe what they say and I support their, and they're now endorsing, just to give an example, abolish the police. That's a pretty wild view. I mean, people hold it sincerely, of course, but it's a pretty wild view. And yet it came to be a view that lots of journalists and people seem to be holding all of a sudden. Well, why is that? Well, you might think that there was a moment at which it was an easy way to stand out and get status for defending this view a couple of years ago, and people sort of followed along. And so the worry is that grandstanding, by incentivizing standing out, by incentivizing status, it can actually affect not just people's views, but partisan politics. I mean, we now have one political party that sort of has an albatross around its neck for having this view that we should abolish the police. Rightly or wrongly, that view became associated with several candidates in lots of races who've now lost.
So I'd say it seems correct that we identify more moral grandstanders at the extremes. The question, though, is there more grandstanding going on at the extremes, or is it that we're just more inclined to label people who are at the extremes as grandstanders? On the account of reasons I think we might be illicitly tempted to call people grandstanders, one of those reasons is that the ideas are so different from how we live or what we're used to or what we believe. They make us uncomfortable. They may be challenging to understand. The farther away some ideas are from, and some judgments are from what you yourself believe or how you yourself live, the more inclined you might be to think, well, what could possibly motivate this? What set of facts are they working with? What underlying moral claims are they working with? I can't think of it. It's got to be BS, right? And if I think that, then yeah, those people are grandstanders. Like the motive. What else is there if not the facts and some moral truth that's motivating them? Well, it's just got to be self-serving, self-interest, right? They want to look good as moral people. Then, I mean, maybe that's the case, but I feel like again, the evidence underdetermines it. I mean, if you want to really stand out as politically today, I suppose in this polarized landscape, we'd have a lot of moral grandstanders who are right in the middle, arguing for moderation. Do we see a lot of that too? Are there? I mean, I guess I'd ask the people who identify a lot of grandstanding: are there moderate grandstanders? Are there a lot of them there? Shouldn't there be?
It's a fair question. Let me throw that to Brandon to
Yeah, it tends not to be. So grandstanding is a normal distribution, and so most people are not doing much of it. Political moderates are not doing much of it, and we keep sort of lapsing back into these discussions of accusations or identifying grandstanding. But, our data is not, we're not asking people to identify grandstanders. We're basically asking them about their motivations, in part about why they engage in public discourse. And some grist for our mill is that one of the best predictors of grandstanding is narcissism. I mean, if you're a narcissist, it's very likely that you're using these discussions of morality and politics to self-promote. And so that is at least some evidence to think that we're hitting upon some psychological construct whereby people are taking their self-interested motivations not just into the dating sphere, not just into their home life, but also taking it into the moral sphere. And to admit that, you don't have to say that, we're good at identifying grandstanders to sort of concede the point that, is everyone grandstanding all the time? No, but a significant number of us are that it's causing problems.
So that actually anticipates the very question I wanted to raise, and it's going to echo something that Justin said in his comments. So, Brandon, what do you think of the assertion that moral grandstanding just simply isn't that common, or at least it's not common enough to be quite so worked up about?
Yeah, well, common compared to what? Common compared to, I eat every day. Common compared to I take vacations very rarely. So what's the comparison for something being common? I think what we've discovered is that people who are engaged in public discourse on a regular basis are grandstanding somewhat regularly. It looks like they're grandstanding, it's sort of crude to put a number on it, but to give you a sense, people who are active on social media and active in political and moral discussions are probably grandstanding a few times a week, right? So is that common? Is that not common? I don't know, common compared to what? I will say that there are lots of people for whom it is extremely common. People who are, their whole lives are politics, and they are narcissists. That's a recipe for something being very common. So I know, in a way, I agree with Justin that it's very hard to know, like, how much of it has to exist for it to be a problem. And what I want to suggest is, well, try it out. Like, see how much conflict is in your life if you go around discussing morality and politics to self-promote.
Well, that's helpful. So go ahead, Justin, please.
Yeah, if you don't mind. So I think Brendan's right that answering this question in a comparative way is important. So when you think about, is something a problem, right, the question might be, well, compared to what, right? Utopia really isn't an option. The absence of problems isn't an option. The real question for us is, which problems are we willing to live with, right? And so grandstanding might be problematic, right? When people engage in it, we might think it's a kind of insincerity or self-seeking behavior that is problematic, but is it a problem really worth worrying about? Well, when we put out this idea that there's moral grandstanding going on, and lots of it going on, right? It makes us cynical about public discourse, makes us skeptical, makes us prone to dismissal of what other people are saying. And if you ask me, like, what's a greater moral problem? Like, being overly credulous to people's moral complaints and beliefs, or being overly dismissive towards them? It would seem to me that overly dismissive is a much more serious problem. We're tempted to dismiss the worries of others, to dismiss the things that others who have different kinds of lives than we do observe as problematic. And we should, I think, be cautious about introducing new terminology, new tools to the landscape of public discourse that allow us to so easily be dismissive.
So, Justin, is it fair to say, and I want to go to some questions that have popped up from folks who are watching in just a moment, but is it fair to say, on your view, that it's not that you're disagreeing with Brandon about moral grandstanding being real or even being, on the whole, bad, but that the real issue is that it's kind of a distraction from things that we ought to be more concerned with in our public conversations? Is that a fair way to express your view, or are you pushing a little harder against Brandon and saying, no, actually, I don't think it's a big deal in its own right?
Well, I think what you said is fair. I think there obviously must be some moral grandstanding going on, because given the amount of discourse, there's all sorts of discourse going on, right? For good and for ill, right? So is it a widespread social problem? My point today has been to say that it is seems to assume that we can know a whole lot about what people are thinking, that it's easy for us to assume, we're tempted to assume, but we might not have good reason to assume. And that the costs of really identifying grandstanding as the problem du jour, or even an important one, is overly dismissiveness when it comes to other people and their worries and problems. And I think we should be more on guard against that.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm I'm interested in some follow-ups, but again, I want to give the floor to some folks who are watching. The first question that came in is from a philosophy lecturer, Mark Herman at Arkansas State, who asked this. He says, do grandstanders consider grandstanding a mistake or an error by their own lights, perhaps when they're reflecting on the activity of grandstanding? Thoughts on that?
That's a great question. Hi, Mark, by the way. I know Mark Herman. That's a great question. I don't know. I think some grandstanders probably think, and I have seen some philosophers defend grandstanding, defend virtue signaling. And they say, no, it's good. It's actually good that people engage in this sort of self-promotion, because it shows we have the right values and it sets an example for other people and so on. Of course, my response to that is, yeah, if only the good people grandstand, if only the people with the right views, and they only grandstand saying true things, and they only, you put all these limits on it, and that you're starting to create a world in which we don't exist in. So I would suspect a lot of grandstanders, because they're narcissists, think it is good, right? Well, of course people need to hear from me. Like, I'm a moral angel. Like, why would they not want to hear what my views are and sort of defer to my judgment? I think a lot of grandstanders probably on reflection, if they knew they were doing it, I feel this way about myself, like, since writing this book, people incessantly accuse me of it whenever I tweet. And every time someone accuses me of it, I have to think, wait, am I? I think on reflection, a lot of people would say, no, I did do that, and that was not good. I shouldn't have abused the public square like that for personal gain. But we don't have any, as far as I know, any empirical evidence about that.
Just to speak quickly on that, so if moral grandstanding is the use of moral talk in order to boost one's moral credibility or one's, how good a person one seems in the eyes of others, I think it's Brandon's right that some versions of that are going to be, when people reflect on them, they're going to think, no, that's not a good thing for me to be doing. But I think it's worth noting that some people, it might be the thing to do, it might make a lot of sense, it might even be morally admirable for them to do, because not everyone's default position in social discourse is, this is a good person who I should listen to, right? Some people are disadvantaged by social stereotypes. Some people have past actions that they've done that are in some ways might be thought to disqualify themselves. And part of what they have to do with their moral talk is establish themselves as someone who's worth listening to. I'm not a terrible person, or the stereotypes you've heard about people like me are not true. And so I might engage in moral status moral talk to improve my moral status to a level of credibility where I'm not, where I can then participate. I think it's that kind of moral talk for self-promotion doesn't seem morally objectionable to me, even if it might technically fit the definition.
That's interesting. It's actually very closely related to the next question in the queue. So I think that, Justin, you may have just answered this, but it's directed to Brandon, so let me toss it out. An anonymous viewer says, moral talk can have various motivations, and legitimate moral talk that benefits the moral sphere might in part be motivated by concerns about self-status. Is moral grandstanding when moral talk is, I think it's meant to be, is it moral grandstanding when moral talk is solely motivated by concerns for self-status? Or are there times when someone is motivated by self-status even when their moral talk is useful or helpful and not polarizing?
Yeah, so here's another situation which I think it can be helpful in a limited way to compare grandstanding to lying. So lying, I think most people agree, even most philosophers agree, that lying is generally bad, and you generally shouldn't lie, even if there are situations in which lying may be the right thing to do, to protect innocent life, and so lying generally is bad, but there are going to be exceptions, and maybe lots of exceptions. I would say something similar about grandstanding. I would say grandstanding is generally bad. Selfishly motivated or self-interested motivation for engaging in discourse is usually bad. Usually it's better to be motivated by concerns for others or concerns for moral rightness or moral principles. I think those tend to be more virtuous kinds of motivations for public discourse. That being said, it's perfectly possible that in some cases, in even many cases, grandstanding might, all things considered, be the thing to do. That doesn't mean it doesn't have any bad consequences. It's just that for other reasons, it's the best thing to do. And I don't think I'm embarrassed to say that, because I think you can say that and say grandstanding is generally bad and you shouldn't do it, just like you can say lying is bad and you shouldn't do it, even if there are cases in which you should lie.
That was a very nice segue to the next question, which brings up the issue of virtue, a word that was in there, and you use the phrase, the thing to do. I know that you're both familiar with this concept. I suspect there may be folks who are watching who aren't familiar with this kind of language. But when people talk about theories of moral right and moral wrong, big philosophical frameworks for understanding what makes something good or bad or right or wrong, one of the possibilities that's out there is what's called virtue theory. And the question in front of us is, does this sort of approach require embracing a virtue-based approach to morality, where you focus on motivations, you focus on character traits and make those the centerpiece of your theory? Or if you're not interested in virtue theory, is that part of the source of the disagreement here?
I'll say something very briefly. I don't want to take away from Justin's time here, but in the book, we basically give three different, no matter what your moral theory is, we give an argument that grandstanding is bad. So in this presentation, I focused on consequences. So you might think that having people motivated in a certain way tends to produce lots of bad consequences, tends to outweigh the benefits of this sort of motivation. So it's a kind of consequentialist argument. We also have several arguments that grandstanding, set aside the consequences. Grandstanding is disrespectful. It's disrespectful to treat people in public discourse as interchangeable punching bags for your self-image. And we also give an argument, sort of a virtue theoretic argument that says, okay, just think about it. Like, how would the virtuous person behave in public discourse? Would they be motivated to help others? Would they be motivated to stand up for moral rights or moral principles? Or would they be more self-interestedly motivated? And our view is the virtuous person would tend to not be motivated to push their own personal moral brand in public discourse. That's just not what they would use public discourse for.
Justin, thoughts on the role of virtue in all of this?
Well, I think I agree with Brandon that if someone thought that grandstanding was a problem, that there are resources in a variety of different kinds of moral theories, deontological moral theories, consequentialist ones, virtue ones, to make that case. And I think that's fine. If I could just say, though, that I think it might be interesting to talk about one of the things that people who are interested in virtue talk about sometimes are the situations we put people in that are more or less conducive to certain kinds of ways of thinking and certain kinds of behavior, certain ways of being. And we might think that our current technological situation, right? We have the internet, we have Facebook, we have Twitter, we have all of these ways of suddenly, it's just been a couple of decades really, being able to talk to the entire world, any one of us, right? That's a very different kind of communicative situation that we've ever been in before. That we're having problems now in various ways might be expected given the suddenness of that change. But it also might point to, if we're thinking about fixing problems that we see with public discourse, might we look at the situations we're putting them in and think, okay, well, maybe certain kinds of reforms and regulations and structuring of the domains of public discourse as they are now would be on order, right? We should say, okay, if there are problems with how Twitter is, not because necessarily someone's expressing their opinion, but when 1,000 people express their opinion like that, in some ways that could be a mobbing of someone to be problematic. Well, how do we structure Twitter so it's not like that, or public discourse so it's to avoid the problems of something like that? I'll leave it at that.
I feel like there's 15 more follow-up questions. I've got a few more in my own notes, but I'm looking at the clock and we are rapidly running out of time. So let me shift gears a little bit and ask each of you for some brief closing comments. If in say 60, 90 seconds or so, what would you like folks who are watching to take away from this conversation?
Happy to give Justin the last word here. So I'll just say I think the upshot, whether you agree or not about whether grandstanding is a problem, I hope we can all agree that public discourse would probably be better off if people had more political and moral and intellectual humility. So set grandstanding aside, I think if we were all a little more modest about our knowledge of the world and our expertise, and that we engage with other people not from a position of let me show you how it is, let me preach to you about how the way the world is, and instead seek to learn and seek to ask questions and seek to clarify. Now, obviously, that's not all that needs to happen, but I think that we could round off the edges a little bit of public discourse by being a little more humble about our views about morality and politics.
I like Brandon's answer a lot. In fact, when you started the question, I thought, well, I guess I'll talk about intellectual humility, because I too think that it's super important. And I think it's interesting, and maybe tells us a little bit about thinking about this matters, that when I think about the importance of intellectual humility, I mean, I'm impressed by just how much humanity has learned over its history, and how good we are also at figuring out how much more there is for us to know. And we do this through science, we do this through social interaction in various ways. I feel like when I think of myself as trying to be someone who shows intellectual humility, one of the things that I'm doing is listening to people, taking seriously what they have to say, trying to make sense of what they're saying, trying to figure out how it could be true. Because I know that I come to these discussions and these debates with my own opinion, my own position, my own background, my own set of experiences, my set of what's normal and what's reasonable. And that's my set, right? But other people who had very different kinds of lives than I have different sets. And I should, if I'm being intellectually humble, I should take what they're saying seriously, at least start with that default position. And that's why my main worry is dismissiveness. And my main worry is just shutting our ears to difference, shutting our ears to disagreement by saying, they're just up to no good. It's just self-servingness. There's no doubt that some of that happens, right? The question is, do we need to focus on that stuff, or do we need to focus more on figuring out how we can listen better to each other?
Well, what a great note on which to come to the end. Let me ask our tech folks who are running the Tri-C side of the slides, if you can bring up slide number 7 of the PowerPoint, and I'll engage in some shameless promotion for some work we're doing here at the Mandel Center. We've recently launched a podcast, and the ethos of this podcast, More Human, is intended very much to be in the same spirit that Brandon and Justin were both just describing. So if you're interested in these kinds of conversations, and if you're interested in stuff that's going on in the humanities, really in general, but particularly humanities-related events and activities in Northeast Ohio, check out tri-c.edu/morehuman for more information on that podcast and the kind of stuff we're doing there. But I will say as we wrap up, thank you very much, Dr. Brandon Warmke. Thank you, Dr. Justin Weinberg. I hope that everybody who's watching has found this as interesting and as enjoyable as I have. And let me invite all of our viewers to consider this the beginning of a conversation and not the end. I hope that you'll keep on exploring these things, keep on talking about them with folks, and don't try to build yourself up too much while you do it. Thank you, gentlemen, both for joining us. Thanks, everybody, for watching. Have a great afternoon.